Hey everyone, your storyteller Jake here. I hope you have a great night and are ready to sleep to this story. Let us begin. The boarded room. The house on Heller Street didn't look haunted. It was stately, with white painted brick and deep green shutters, standing on a modest corner in the older suburb of Brookfield, just outside of Chicago. The lawn was overgrown, yes, and the iron gate had rusted so long ago it groaned like a throat clearing in protest, but still, by all outward appearances, it was just a house. Frank Delaney liked it that way. He wasn't interested in charm. Not anymore. He wanted a place to be left alone, and this house, with its suspiciously low listing price and vague disclosure statements, seemed perfect. The real estate agent, a nervous woman in a blue suit too bright for the occasion, had walked him through quickly. Her voice was cheerful but brittle. Original floors, sir. Gas lighting fixtures still intact. And over 4,000 square feet, you'd be getting a bargain. Frank had noticed something as they walked upstairs. One of the doors in the hallway was boarded up, thick pine planks nailed straight across the frame. What's this? He'd asked, pausing in front of it. The agent's face had gone still. Ah. That room was sealed by the previous owner. Said it was a family matter. You don't have to open it, you know. Frank raised an eyebrow. What kind of family matter? She smiled nervously. It's best left alone. A bit of superstition, perhaps. If you'd rather not include it in the inspection. I want it included. He'd signed the papers that same week. 3 days later, he moved in with only what he could carry in his old Dodge pickup, a suitcase of clothes, some basic cookware, a cot, a box of books, and the only photo he kept of Helen, his wife. Helen had died 11 months earlier in a late-night car crash on the I-55 expressway. She'd been driving home alone after visiting her sister in Joliet. A deer, they said, swerved too hard. The photo he kept showed her laughing on their wedding day, eyes full of fire and rain. Since then, Frank had felt like a ghost in his own body. The house was quiet. Eerily so. His first night, he laid his cot in the study, an old mahogany-lined room on the first floor where the fireplace still worked. Rain tapped the windows, soft and rhythmic, as he unpacked a weathered book of poetry. At precisely 3:11 a.m. he woke. Not from a dream, but from a sound. A slow, deliberate scraping. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the walls. It was upstairs. Directly above him. Where the boarded door was. Frank sat up, heart thudding. He listened for a full minute, but the sound didn't return. When he stood, the floor creaked loudly beneath him. He poured a glass of water, stared up at the ceiling, and said nothing. He would not be the kind of man who let himself be scared of noise. The next day, Frank avoided the second floor altogether. He busied himself with simple tasks, unpacking his few belongings, organizing the kitchen, oiling the front door hinges. Anything to stay away from the hallway upstairs. But the boarded room remained in the back of his mind like a splinter under the skin. That night, he made a fire in the study's hearth and read until the flames died down. The old grandfather clock in the hallway struck 1, then 2. By 3, he'd nearly drifted off. And then, the scraping returned. This time, it wasn't faint. It dragged long and slow, as if something solid and sharp was being drawn across wood. Frank sat upright, the blanket slipping from his shoulders. There it was again. Louder. Scrape. He grabbed his flashlight, then paused. His feet were cold. His fingers trembled slightly. It's nothing. A rat, maybe? But he didn't believe it. He crept up the stairs, one creaking step at a time. The flashlight's beam quivered slightly as he reached the second floor. There, at the end of the hall, stood the boarded door. Something was different. He couldn't say what, at first. But the hallway smelled. Not rot. Not mildew. Something sweeter. Like perfume. Faint, powdered, and wrong. He stood in front of the door, his breath fogging in the cold air that seemed to cling only to this stretch of hallway. He pressed his ear against the wood. Nothing. Silence. Until. Tap, tap, tap. 3 soft knocks from the other side. Frank stepped back quickly. "Who's there?" he said before he could stop himself. No answer. He reached out slowly and touched one of the boards. It felt damp. The next morning, he called the agent. "I want to know what was in that room," he said, his voice curt. The agent hesitated. "Mr. Delaney, it really wasn't." "You're going to tell me?" There was a pause. Then she said quietly, "There was a child. A girl. The previous owner had a daughter who passed. After that, they sealed the room and refused to ever go inside again." "How did she die?" "They said she fell off the landing. Broke her neck." "But," the woman's voice dropped lower, "there were rumors that she was sleepwalking. That she was speaking to someone in the mirror." Frank felt the air go out of the room. He hung up without saying goodbye. That night, at exactly 3:11 a.m., he heard the scraping again. Only this time, it didn't stop. It circled, dragging across the entire width of the room. Then a slow thud. And another. And then the whisper. "You saw me." Frank didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat in the study, flashlight in hand, every light in the house blazing. His heart still thudded with adrenaline, not from fear exactly, but from recognition. The whisper hadn't come from inside his head. It had echoed off the floorboards, across the ceiling. The voice had shape, presence. "You saw me." 3 words. Soft. Young. Female. He didn't tell himself it was a dream. Something about the voice, the clarity, the pacing, told him otherwise. At dawn, he made coffee and went upstairs. This time, he stood directly in front of the boarded door, eyes narrowed. The boards looked older now, soaked through, maybe warped from moisture. He noticed the edges weren't sealed tight. There were gaps, where warm air from the hallway leaked into the colder space beyond. Frank bent down and pressed his palm to the floor. Cold. Too cold. He stood, took a breath, and walked back to the tool shed. He didn't believe in ghosts. But he did believe in his gut, and right now, his gut told him he had to see what was inside that room. By noon, he returned with a pry bar, hammer, and gloves. One by one, he began pulling the boards off the door. The nails resisted at first. Then, curiously, the final fuse slid out almost too easily, like the wood had given up. He stood before the door. It was older than the rest of the house's doors, painted over at least a dozen times, but the outline of carved vines still showed through in the molding. The key was in the lock. A heavy bronze shape, worn smooth at the edges. He turned it. Click. The door swung open an inch. Cold air whooshed out. The room was untouched. A little girl's bedroom, preserved as if it had been sealed the day she died. Wallpaper of faded roses curled at the corners. A twin bed stood against the wall, dressed in lace-trimmed sheets yellowed with age. On the dresser, a row of dolls with porcelain faces and cracked eyes. A music box. A rocking horse. And directly across from the bed, a tall, oval mirror. It was pristine. No dust. No fog. No signs of time at all. Frank stepped inside, boots creaking on the wood floor. The air felt wrong, thicker somehow. He turned toward the mirror. His own reflection stared back, tired eyes, gray hair, a day's worth of stubble. And then, his reflection blinked. But he didn't. He froze. The reflection smiled. Frank backed out of the room so quickly he nearly tripped. He slammed the door shut behind him and renailed every board. Harder this time. Deeper. Whatever was inside that room, whatever had smiled at him in that mirror, it wasn't just a memory. Frank didn't leave the house that day. He sat in the kitchen long after the sun had gone down, one hand wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee, the other gripping the arms of the chair like it might slip away from under him. The mirror. The blink. The smile. He replayed it over and over in his mind. It wasn't a trick of light. not a dream. He knew what he'd seen. It had reacted to him, looked at him, and smiled. He returned to the study just before 10, lighting a fire even though the weather was mild. The flames helped chase back the images in his head. But he didn't sleep. Instead, he sat with Helen's photo, the only piece of comfort left to him in this strange, silent house. "Is this what you meant to leave me with?" he muttered aloud. "A place full of holes and ghosts?" He thought he might cry, but the tears never came. Only the weight, heavy in his chest like soaked cloth. 3:11 a.m. came without fanfare. No scraping at first. No whisper. Just the wind outside, soft against the old glass. And then, thump. From above. Then again. Thump, drag, thump. Like something small, heavy, being pulled across a floor. Frank closed his eyes. Not again. He rose to his feet and made it halfway up the stairs before stopping. From the landing, he could see the hallway door. Still boarded shut. Still sealed. But something moved just beyond it. A shadow. It passed slowly across the gap at the bottom of the door. And then, a whisper. Closer this time. Not from inside the room. From the hallway. "Don't leave me here again." Frank turned sharply. The hallway was empty. His pulse thundered in his ears. He wanted to run, but instead he whispered, "Who are you?" Silence. Then, "You know me." A coldness passed through his chest like falling into water. He stepped backward down one stair. And then, something impossible. From the study below, a sound, Helen's voice. "Frank?" He froze. "Frank, I need you." He turned and ran. Down the stairs, around the corner, through the archway. But the study was empty. The fire still burned low, casting shadows against the walls. No one there. But on the floor, in front of the hearth, lay something that hadn't been there before. A child-stuffed rabbit. Worn. Gray. One ear missing. Frank picked it up slowly. He remembered it. Helen had shown it to him once. "My mother gave it to me when I was 6, she'd said. "I lost it when we moved. I cried for days. And now it was here. In his study. But that wasn't possible. Helen had never been to this house." Frank held the stuffed rabbit in both hands, staring at it like it might vanish. The faded stitching, the flattened fur, it was unmistakably hers. A perfect replica, or maybe, the real thing. But that didn't make sense. Helen had lost the rabbit when she was a child, over 30 years ago. He remembered how wistful she'd sounded when she talked about it. They'd looked for something similar once, at an antique fair. Never found one quite the same. And now here it was. In this house. He searched every room on the first floor, but found no sign of an intruder. All doors were locked. Windows secured. Eventually, he returned to the study and set the rabbit on the mantel. As he looked at it, unease crawled up his spine like cold fingers. Something was playing with him. Not haunting him, testing him. The next day, he didn't eat. Instead, he went up to the attic, a space he hadn't yet explored. The air smelled of dust and dry paper. Boxes lined the rafters, stacked carelessly beneath a single hanging bulb. He found old books, sheet music, a broken rocking chair, and something else. A small cassette recorder. It was black, scratched, with a piece of yellowed tape stuck to the back. 1974 Evelyn, handwritten in ink. Curious, he checked the battery compartment. Still intact. He pressed play. Nothing at first, just static. Then, a woman's voice. Distant, like a recording made in another room. "Can you hear me?" Another voice followed, this one much younger. "Yes." "What do you see in the mirror?" "My friend." "What's her name?" "She says not to tell." Then silence. Then something else. A third voice. "He's listening now." Frank dropped the recorder. It clattered to the floor, tape still spinning. He left the attic immediately, heart pounding in his ears. He didn't stop until he was outside on the front porch, breathing in the cool morning air. Later that evening, Frank sat alone in the kitchen. The recorder sat on the table in front of him. Still. Silent. He played the tape again. It sounded different this time, clearer. Sharper. The child's voice repeated. "She says not to tell?" Frank leaned closer. Then came the whisper again. "Frank." He dropped the tape recorder again. But this time it didn't stop playing. "You saw me. You opened the door. Now I can open yours." He stepped back from the table, eyes fixed on the dark hallway beyond. The overhead light flickered. And then, from upstairs, a giggle. Small. Delicate. Childlike. The giggle echoed down the staircase like a ripple in still water, soft, but unnatural. Frank stared upward, frozen in place, every muscle tensed. He wasn't afraid of ghosts. Not really. But this wasn't a creaking door or a cold draft. This was laughter. Mocking. Intentional. He moved quietly to the bottom of the stairs, heart pounding. Every step creaked under his weight as he slowly climbed. The light from the kitchen didn't reach past the third stair. The hallway above lay in thick shadow. As he reached the top, he smelled that faint, sickly sweet perfume again. The door to the boarded room was still shut. The planks held. But the giggle had not come from behind it. It had come from down the hallway, toward the guest bedroom. Frank approached it carefully, listening. The air was heavy, pressurized. He pushed open the door. Inside, nothing had changed. Except for the mirror. It had fogged over, though there was no heat or water source to explain it. He stepped closer. The fog swirled slightly, like breath on cold glass. Then, slowly, shapes began to form. At first, just shadows. But then, something clearer. A child's handprint. Small. Right in the center of the mirror. And next to it, another. Frank reached out, about to touch the glass, when he stopped. In the reflection, just for a second, he saw something behind him. A shape. Small. Still. He turned. Nothing. But his reflection still showed the child. Standing in the corner of the room. Pale, with a white nightgown and long black hair hanging limp across her face. She didn't move. Frank's chest seized. He turned again. Still nothing there. When he looked back at the mirror, she was closer. Now standing just behind him in the reflection. Her eyes were visible now, wide, hollow sockets, impossibly black. He spun around, ready to confront her. The room was empty, but the door slammed shut behind him. Frank lunged for the doorknob, heart hammering. It opened easily, as if it had never moved. The hallway was empty. Quiet again. He went back downstairs without a word, locked every door, and turned every light on in the house. That night, at 3:11 a.m., there was no scraping. Instead, the voice returned. Not whispered this time. Spoken. Calm. "You're mine now, Frank." Frank barely slept. At sunrise, he sat hunched over the dining table, 3 cups of coffee in, the house still eerily silent. The voice had sounded real. Not in his mind. Not imagined. The words, "You're mine now," had come from somewhere. They rang with confidence. Ownership. Like whoever, or whatever, was speaking thought it had already won. By 9 a.m., Frank was back in the attic. He couldn't stop thinking about the cassette tape. He sifted through boxes for hours, hoping for more context, something, anything that could explain the girl's identity. He found yellowed newspaper clippings, a birth certificate, a few letters signed. Evelyn P. in a child's handwriting. Then, in a dusty envelope labeled simply, "Coroner's Notes, 1974. He found it. A police report. Only a page and a half long, typed and water-stained, but legible. Deceased, Evelyn Price, age 9. Found 2nd floor landing, lower cervical fracture, blood pooling consistent with rapid trauma. Time of death. Estimated between 2:45 a.m. and 3:15 a.m. No eyewitnesses. Parent testimony inconsistent. There was a handwritten note scrawled along the margin. Said she was talking to her friend in the mirror. Another line was crossed out beneath that. Frank held the paper in shaking hands. The weight of it settled in his chest like ice. This wasn't just a ghost story. A child had died here. Alone. In the middle of the night. Talking to something no one else could see. That evening, Frank didn't wait for 3:11. At midnight, he stood in the hallway, staring at the boarded door. He raised the hammer again, but this time, not to seal it tighter. One by one, he removed the planks. He opened the door. The room was just as he'd left it, childlike, delicate, preserved in time. Except now, the mirror was glowing faintly. A silvery light pulsed behind the glass, like moonlight trapped in water. Frank stepped inside. As he crossed the threshold, the air thickened. His breath fogged. The door creaked shut behind him. He approached the mirror cautiously. It no longer showed his reflection. Instead, it showed the room. But not as it was now, as it had been. Full of daylight, the bed neatly made, the dolls fresh and bright. And in the corner, sitting on the floor, Evelyn. She looked up and smiled. I knew you'd come back. Frank stood frozen, breath caught in his throat. The girl in the mirror, Evelyn, sat cross-legged in the reflection, wearing a pale blue nightgown. Her hair was parted neatly, her expression soft, even friendly. But her eyes, too still, too old, as if they'd watched 1,000 midnights pass without blinking. You found my room, she said. You weren't supposed to. Frank's lips parted. Evelyn? She tilted her head. You remember me. He blinked. We've never met. Evelyn smiled. Not in the way you think. Behind her, in the mirror's version of the room, shadows twitched at the corners. The light flickered faintly, as if something just out of frame had moved. Frank stepped closer. What do you want? Her smile faded. To be seen. That's all I ever wanted. She placed her hand on the inside of the mirror. People walk past me. They cover me up. But you... Her smile returned. You looked... Frank hesitated, staring at the place where her palm met the glass. It was just a mirror. Right. He raised his own hand slowly, hesitantly touching the surface. Cold. Like touching ice beneath water. But as soon as he made contact... Crack. A thin fracture spread outward from where their palms aligned. A whisper echoed from the mirror, not Evelyn this time, but something deeper. Come closer. Frank recoiled, stumbling back. The reflection snapped away. No more Evelyn, no more room. Just the study behind him. The mirror now showed only him, wide-eyed and pale. The light overhead flickered, then went out. All at once, the room was pitch dark. Frank fumbled for his flashlight, but the beam cut out as soon as he clicked it on. From the mirror came the sound of slow breathing. Inhale, exhale, inhale. Then the soft sound of bare feet stepping across the floor. Closer. He backed away blindly until he hit the door. And then... a voice, just inches from his ear. You let me out. Frank slammed the door open and sprinted into the hall. The hallway lights flickered wildly, popping one after another as he passed. Down the stairs. Into the foyer. He didn't stop. He ran out the front door and into the street, barefoot, shaking. It was past 3 a.m. The sky above was moonless, the neighborhood silent. He stood there for a long time, catching his breath. Inside the house, every light flicked off. And in the upstairs window, Evelyn stood watching, smiling. Frank didn't go back inside until dawn. He sat on the curb across the street, watching the second-floor window, waiting for a sign that she was gone. That it was gone. But Evelyn had disappeared before the sun touched the shutters. At 6:47 a.m., with sore feet and a numb spine, Frank stood, walked slowly back up the porch steps, and re-entered the house. It smelled off, like damp cloth and burnt sugar. The kind of smell you remember from a hospital wing or the deep end of an old basement. The house was quiet, but not peaceful. It was holding its breath. He didn't go upstairs, not right away. Instead, Frank sat at the kitchen table, placed the stuffed rabbit on the center, and stared at it for an hour. "I didn't let her out," he whispered. "Did I?" But even as he asked the question, he knew the answer. The mirror had cracked when he touched it. He had crossed some invisible threshold. And now Evelyn wasn't just behind glass anymore. Around noon, he finally climbed the stairs. Everything was as it had been: the hallway, the boarded door still open, the scent of powder and old flowers lingering in the air. But when he reached the room again, something had changed. The mirror was gone. No, it was still there, but it was no longer reflecting the room. Instead, it showed a hallway. Not the one he stood in. It was darker. The walls were cracked. Faded wallpaper peeled like bark. And then a figure appeared. Not Evelyn. Helen. His wife. Frank staggered backward, nearly tripping. No! In the mirror, Helen stood barefoot on a cold floor, eyes wide, lips trembling. She looked like she had the day they said goodbye, before the accident. Before the funeral. She stepped closer in the reflection. "Frank," she whispered. "Help me." He dropped to his knees. "No. No, you're gone. This isn't real. You saw me. You opened the door." But the voice wasn't Helen's anymore. It was Evelyn's again. The reflection blurred and twisted. Helen's eyes turned black. Her mouth opened too wide, teeth too many. The face screamed, warping into Evelyn's again, older, sharper, monstrous. Frank turned and fled the room. That night, he removed every mirror in the house. The bathroom, the hallway, the wardrobe, the study. Each one he covered in sheets, then dragged down to the basement. He sat alone in the kitchen with the flashlight and the last mirror, small, handheld, silver-framed. Helen's from their wedding? He almost threw it out. But he couldn't. Instead, he wrapped it in a scarf and locked it in a drawer. And upstairs, behind the boarded door, Evelyn whispered to the empty air. "There are mirrors everywhere." The next morning, Frank woke to silence, not peace, but pause. A silence so unnatural it hummed in his ears like pressure building inside the walls. For the first time in days, there was no 311 scraping. No whisper. No laughter. But that didn't comfort him. It meant she was planning something. Frank went into town that day. Not for groceries. Not for help. He went to the Brookfield Historical Society. The building sat on the edge of the town square, a red brick structure that used to be a post office. Inside, a woman in her 70s named Ms. Carroll kept watch over the dusty archives with the same care a guard dog gives a locked gate. She looked up as Frank entered. "You're the man who bought the Price house," she said flatly, before he even introduced himself. Frank paused. "I didn't know it had a name." "Oh, it does," she said, pushing her glasses up. "That house is the reason we keep records in pencil. Too many people come back wanting things erased." He sat with her for 3 hours. Together, they unearthed a box labeled Property 1341 Heller Street. Inside were floor plans, deed transfers, newspaper clippings, and one thin file with a photo of Evelyn Price. She looked about 9 years old in the photo, standing with her parents in front of the house, her expression blank. Her father's hand rested tightly on her shoulder. Her mother's eyes seemed distant. "What happened to her?" Frank asked. Carol sighed, her eyes scanning the page. "They said she sleepwalked. Fell down the stairs. But," she hesitated. "But," Evelyn's mother, Margaret, claimed Evelyn had started talking to someone in the mirror. Someone who told her secrets. Who showed her things. Carol leaned closer. After the funeral, Margaret disappeared for nearly a year. When she came back, she boarded up the room and refused to live in the house. Her husband sold it within a month. Frank frowned. And the mirrors? Carol hesitated again. Then pulled out a small note, handwritten, almost illegible. She wrote this in a church journal. They move when you're not looking. They find you in your sleep. And then, don't bring a mirror to the third floor. It sees them too. Frank felt the hairs on his arms rise. Back at home, he placed the note beside Helen's mirror, still locked in the drawer. At 3:11 that night, a faint knock echoed from the upstairs hallway. Then the voice again. Clear. Did you find my picture? He didn't answer. I used to love it when Mama brushed my hair, but now, it hurts. The sound of fingernails on wood followed. Then silence. Then one final whisper, just at the edge of sleep. You should never have come here alone. Frank didn't sleep. He waited for the sun to rise like a man expecting a fire to spread across the sky. By 6 a.m., he was pacing the kitchen, staring at the old church note Carol had shown him. Don't bring a mirror to the third floor. He kept rereading it, fixating on the last part. It sees them too. What was it? The mirror? The house? Something else? He unlocked the drawer. Helen's hand mirror sat exactly where he'd left it, wrapped in the silk scarf. For a long time, Frank just stared at it, afraid to touch it again. Then, as if on impulse, he picked it up, unwrapped it slowly. The silver frame shimmered faintly, like water catching moonlight. He raised it to his face. Nothing strange. No black-eyed girls. No whispers. Just his own tired, pale reflection staring back. But the longer he held it, the heavier it seemed. As if it wanted to be heavier. That day, he returned to the Historical Society, but Carol was gone. A man named Jacob sat at the desk, much younger, unfriendly. I'm looking for church records. Late 1970s, Frank said. Jacob scowled. Destroyed in a flood. Most of 76 through 78. Why? Someone left a note in a journal. Margaret Price. Jacob raised an eyebrow. The Evelyn Price case? Frank nodded. I think her mother knew something. Something the rest of us didn't. Jacob leaned back. Everyone knows that house is cursed, Mr. Delaney. You think you're the first person to show up asking about the boarded room? Frank froze. Others came here? 3 men over the past decade. 2 tried living there. 1 was an investigator. What happened to them? Jacob shrugged. 1 left the country. 1 checked into a psychiatric facility. The investigator disappeared. They found his car outside the property a year later. Keys still in the ignition. That night, Frank sat in the study, staring at the fire. The rabbit still sat on the mantel. Helen's mirror was locked away again. But the air had shifted. He could feel her now. Evelyn. Not just at 3:11. Not just in mirrors. She was watching all the time. In the reflections of spoons, in the dark windows at night, in the gleam of water in the sink. Every shiny surface had become a door. At exactly 3:11 a.m., he heard it again. This time, not a whisper. A sob. From the basement. A child's voice, quiet and broken. I didn't mean to fall. Frank sat up, every nerve firing at once. I just wanted to go through. The mirror said it would be quick. Then silence. Then laughter, brief and sharp. Like someone delighted to be remembered. Frank stood at the top of the basement steps, flashlight in one hand, the other resting on the railing. The house was dead quiet, save for the creak of the boards beneath his feet and the soft hum of the refrigerator behind him. The sobbing had stopped. But he still heard something. A faint scuffing sound. Like bare feet moving across concrete. He took a deep breath, flicked on the flashlight, and stepped down. Each stair groaned under his weight, but he forced himself to move slowly. Deliberately. The light cast long shadows across the unfinished brick walls. At the bottom, the air was colder, wet and stale, like a place forgotten by time. He swept the flashlight across the room. The mirrors he'd dumped here days before still leaned against the walls. Sheets covered most of them, but a few had slipped off. Even in the low light, they shimmered faintly. He kept his distance from them. In the far corner, beneath the stairs, lay something small. He approached it carefully. A single child's shoe. Patent leather. Scuffed and worn. Next to it, a tuft of black hair. Frank's stomach turned. He bent down slowly and reached for the shoe, when something tapped behind him. He spun around, flashlight beam trembling. In one of the uncovered mirrors, a figure stood just over his shoulder. Evelyn. She didn't move. Didn't blink. Her face was pale, almost gray. Her hair hung in thick, wet strands. And her mouth was too wide, stretched in a grin that didn't match her sad, sunken eyes. "You're not leaving, Frank," she said. Her voice didn't echo in the room. It came from inside his mind. "You saw too much." He stepped back from the mirror. "What are you?" "You let me out." Her image flickered, once, twice, then vanished. The mirror was empty again. Frank turned and fled up the stairs, not daring to look back. As he reached the main floor, the basement door slammed shut behind him on its own. He locked it, then pushed a chair in front of it for good measure. He didn't sleep. That night, he sat with Helen's mirror again. He wanted answers. He needed her. He unwrapped the scarf and stared into the glass, waiting, hoping. And slowly, ever so slowly, Helen appeared. Her eyes were soft. No blackness. No monster mouth. Just her. She didn't speak at first. Then, "Frank, you need to leave." His throat tightened. "Why are you here?" "She found me. In the places you kept me. In your memories." His hands trembled. "I didn't want to forget you. And now she's using me." Helen's eyes darkened. Her voice fractured. "Get out before." The mirror cracked. Then shattered. Frank stumbled back, glass slicing across his palms. Helen's voice dissolved into static. And from upstairs that sound returned. Thump. Drag. Thump. Followed by a new voice, young, high-pitched, and delighted. "You broke your promise, Frank." Frank wrapped a dish towel around his bleeding hand, but the sting barely registered. His mind was fixed on what he'd just seen, Helen, really her, staring back at him from the mirror. Not a trick, not a twisted vision. For a moment she had been real again. And Evelyn had shattered it. Frank sat on the floor for nearly an hour, heart thudding, breath shallow. A fine dusting of mirror shards sparkled across the rug like frozen ash. His palms throbbed. He finally stood and limped to the sink, washing the cuts under cold water. The blood spiraled down the drain, thin and dark. Somewhere behind him, the walls creaked. Or maybe it was a voice, too faint to understand. By late morning, he was outside, pacing the overgrown yard behind the house, searching for something, anything, to ground him. His thoughts circled like carrion birds, the cassette, the newspaper clippings, the sobbing in the basement, the hallway footsteps. And Helen. He had to find a way to speak to her again. He returned to the attic, hands still trembling, and rummaged through boxes until he found a battered photo album. Most of the pictures were of strangers, sepia portraits from the early 1900s, children posed stiffly beside grim-faced parents. But tucked in the back, hidden behind a torn envelope, he found a Polaroid. It showed Evelyn, older than the last photo he'd seen, standing beside a full-length mirror. Her hand was pressed against the glass. But what made Frank go cold was what the image captured in the reflection. It wasn't Evelyn. Not entirely. The reflection had darker eyes. A wider mouth. And something else, fingers, too many of them, curling over the glass from the other side. He turned the photo over. A single sentence was scrawled on the back in faded blue ink. She never left. We only shut the door. Frank packed a bag that afternoon. The mirror was gone, Helen unreachable, and Evelyn had begun to appear outside the sealed room. The game had changed. He would leave. Tonight. But that night, the house wouldn't let him go. At 2:47 a.m., he woke to the sound of shattering glass. Again. But this time from inside his bedroom. He reached for the flashlight. But it wouldn't turn on. He rose slowly, barefoot on cold wood. Across the room, the window was broken. Shards of glass glittered on the floor, catching the pale light from the hallway. A single item lay in the middle of the shards, a stuffed rabbit. Helen's. He turned to the door, just as it began to creak open on its own. Evelyn stood there, hair covering her face. "You were going to leave me?" Frank stepped back. "You're not real." She giggled, head tilting at an impossible angle. "Then why do I remember you?" Frank backed away, heart pounding. Evelyn stood framed in the doorway, the hallway light flickering behind her. Her hair still hung in tangled strands, her pale feet dirty, her voice light as frost on glass. "I remember you," she said again. "You looked at me like they didn't." Frank's voice came out in a whisper. "I've never seen you before I bought this house." She smiled. "But I saw you long before that." The temperature in the room dropped. Breath steamed in the air. The shadows in the corners of the ceiling grew denser, deeper. Frank glanced toward the window, but it was 3 stories down. No escape. He took another step back and grabbed the drawer where he'd kept Helen's mirror, but it was empty. Gone. Evelyn's head tilted farther. Too far. A sickening crack echoed in her neck. "You talked to her so long. You never talked to me." "What do you want from me?" Frank said. His voice cracked. "To stay. To see me." She stepped inside. The door creaked shut behind her without a hand. Frank reached into his coat, fumbling for the small silver cross Helen had worn, which he kept on a chain. It wasn't about faith, it was a tether. A memory. "I remember her," he said, holding the chain out like it might burn. "And you can't take her." Evelyn's smile vanished. For a brief moment, her shape seemed to flicker, her outline bending, pulsing, as if her form couldn't hold itself together. "She let me in, Frank. Because you left the door open." Then she vanished. Gone, like dust blown off a table. The door slammed shut. The light overhead burst in a sharp flash, sending sparks raining to the floor. Frank stood in the sudden dark, the chain still in his outstretched hand. Then, from inside the closet behind him, came a whisper. "I'm still here." He turned slowly. The closet door was cracked open. He approached it with hesitant steps, every nerve screaming to run. He opened the door fully. Inside, nothing. Just darkness. And the faint scent of dust and perfume. Until he looked up. On the closet ceiling, scrawled in childish handwriting. "You promised you'd never leave me." Frank staggered back. The writing was fresh. Still dripping. Then, from somewhere downstairs, 3 sharp knocks. Not the front door. Not the basement. The boarded room. Frank descended the stairs in darkness, barefoot, holding the silver chain like it could keep the walls from closing in. The house had taken on a new quality, less like a home, more like a maze. Every shadow now felt deliberate. Every door, a trap. The knocks had come from the 2nd floor. The boarded room. But when he reached the hallway, he stopped short. The door was wide open. The boards pried off and scattered across the floor. Inside, the mirror stood in its usual place. Untouched. Frank approached the doorway slowly. The air grew denser with each step. His ears rang with pressure. His vision blurred slightly at the edges. He stepped into the room. The dolls had moved. Each porcelain face now pointed toward the mirror, their blank stares focused in collective silence. One doll had fallen to the floor, its head cracked clean down the middle. The rocking horse was in motion, gently swaying. Back and forth. Back and forth. Frank stood before the mirror. His own reflection stared back, but it looked wrong. His face was off by a fraction, his eyes slightly delayed, the light not quite matching reality. He raised the silver chain and held it in front of the glass. The reflection didn't raise it. Instead, it smiled. Then Evelyn appeared beside the reflection. Not in the room. Only in the mirror. Her voice was calm. Almost warm. Do you want her back? Frank's mouth was dry. What? Helen. I can bring her back. He stared. She's behind the glass now. Like I was. You can see her again. Talk to her. Be with her. All you have to do is say yes. His knees weakened. She's gone. You're lying, he whispered. She's waiting. And she's cold. The image shifted. Now Helen stood in the mirror beside Evelyn. She looked alive. Real. Her eyes were glassy, but kind. Frank, she whispered. Please. I don't want to be alone. Frank reached toward the mirror. His hand touched the surface, cold as always. Helen raised her own hand, placing it against his. A perfect match. Say yes, Evelyn said again. The mirror began to hum, low, like a faraway bell. Frank's head spun. He stepped back. No, he said louder this time. That's not her. Evelyn's face darkened. Her mouth twisted into something inhuman. The mirror cracked. A second later, all the lights in the room exploded in sparks. The rocking horse slammed against the wall on its own. From the mirror, Evelyn shrieked, not loud, but deep, vibrating in the bones of the walls. Frank turned and ran, slamming the door behind him. Downstairs, the whispers followed him. You were supposed to say yes. She was so close. He collapsed in the study, chest heaving, the silver chain burning cold in his hand. He'd nearly done it. Nearly believed the illusion. And somehow, Evelyn had known exactly what to offer. Frank stayed in the study until morning. The fire had burned to nothing but embers, but he sat in front of it anyway, knees drawn up, blanket over his shoulders like armor. He didn't sleep. He didn't blink for long. Every time his eyelids dropped, he saw her, Evelyn, grinning, whispering, offering Helen like a carrot before a trap. At dawn, the silence was overwhelming. No footsteps above. No whispers in the pipes. No dolls turning their heads. But the scent of smoke lingered, though nothing burned. By noon, Frank made a decision. He retrieved the small, cracked mirror from the bedroom, the last piece of glass left unbroken in the house. A jagged arc fractured its surface like a crescent moon. Carefully, he wrapped it in a towel, placed it in the passenger seat of his truck, and drove to a nearby church. Not for God. For grounding. The old chapel was quiet. Frank entered through the side door, and found an older man polishing pews in the back. Are you the priest? Frank asked, voice rough from disuse. The man looked up. I was. Retired. But I still sweep. I need something cleansed, Frank said. The man studied him a moment, then gestured toward the altar. You brought it with you. Frank nodded and unwrapped the mirror. The priest's eyes darkened as he stepped forward. He didn't touch it. You know what this is, Frank said. The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, objects don't hold spirits. They hold doors. And when doors stay open too long, he tapped his temple, they start letting themselves in. Frank stared. Can you close it? The priest looked at him sadly. Maybe. But I'd ask why you opened it. Frank looked away. Someone I lost, he said. I thought maybe. The priest sighed. It's never them talking back, son. It just wears their faces. Back home, Frank reboarded the room. But it wasn't the wood he trusted. It was the nails he dipped in salt water and scratched crosses into with a screwdriver. He sealed the mirror pieces in a metal box and buried them in the garden behind the house, beneath the dead lilac tree. Still, that night the house felt her. Every creak in the floorboards. Every rustle in the walls. She was pushing back. At 3:11 a.m., the whispers returned. But not Evelyn. Dozens of voices. Children. Crying. Whispering. Calling names. Frank lay frozen in bed as the room chilled again. The crying turned to giggling. Then into harsh, rhythmic tapping from inside the walls. He whispered into the dark. "What do you want from me?" A single voice answered, Evelyn's, older now. Deeper. "I want you to remember what you did. I want you to remember what you did." Those words rattled through Frank's skull long after they were spoken. But no matter how hard he tried to piece them together, what she meant, what he'd done, he came up empty. He hadn't hurt anyone. He'd never met Evelyn. He was just a man who bought the wrong house at the wrong time. Wasn't he? The next morning, Frank pulled out every photo album and diary Helen had left behind. Something was wrong, something deeply embedded, and he could feel it now like a tumor just beneath the skin. He flipped through page after page, family holidays, wedding photos, postcards from long-forgotten trips. But something stood out in one of Helen's journals. A brief, scribbled entry. "He talks about the little girl again. Says she visits in his sleep. I think he's dreaming about our daughter. But we never had one." Frank's heart stopped. He stared at the page, reading it over and over. The words swam. He didn't remember telling Helen anything about a little girl. Not then. Not ever. But there it was. He had brought her up. Years ago. That night, he dreamt again. The hallway stretched on endlessly, wallpaper peeling like skin. The mirror at the end pulsed like a living thing. He approached it, unable to stop himself, feet moving of their own accord. In the mirror, Evelyn, older than ever now. 15, maybe 16. Her dress black, her eyes still hollow. She spoke. "You knew me before. You just didn't want to remember." Frank shook his head, mouth dry. "No, that's not possible." The mirror flickered. Flashed. Suddenly, the reflection was a boy, him, maybe 9 or 10 years old, standing beside a girl with dark curls and a small, crooked smile. They stood in a hallway just like this one. Frank's knees buckled. "No. You left me there," she said, her voice now the girl's from the memory. "We played hide and seek. You left. You never told." He fell to his knees. "That's not. That can't be. You forgot." "I didn't." Frank woke gasping, soaked in sweat. The memory faded the way dreams do, but the weight of it remained. He hadn't just found Evelyn. He had known her. Somehow. Somewhen. He returned to the attic the next morning, searching frantically. He ripped through every box, every envelope, until, finally, he found something. An old photo, faded and yellowing. It showed a group of children at a birthday party. Balloons. Cake. Laughter. And in the middle, young Frank. And beside him, a girl. The same girl from the mirror. Her name was scribbled on the back. Evelyn. He didn't just move into her house. He brought her home. The photo in Frank's shaking hands had rewired his understanding of everything. He knew Evelyn. Not from this house. Not from whispered voices or haunted dreams. From childhood. Somewhere in the maze of forgotten summers and half-lost afternoons, he had met her, played with her, laughed with her. And then what? Frank stared at the names on the back of the photo. Evelyn Price. Frank Delaney. August 1974. That date stopped him cold. If Evelyn died in 1974, and this photo was taken that year, then he had been there. That summer. In this house. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a return. A reckoning. He sat in the attic for hours, the sun rising and falling through the cracked window. More fragments of memory emerged now, unbidden and sharp. He saw himself, small, barefoot, running through halls. Laughing. Ducking behind furniture. "Let's play hide and seek," a girl's voice had said. "But you have to promise not to leave." He'd promised. And then, he'd hidden. He remembered the attic door creaking open. The hallway going silent. And never finding her again. That night, Frank lit every candle he could find. He walked the house like a ritual, holding the photo in one hand, the silver chain in the other. When he reached the boarded door, he didn't stop. He removed the planks. Quietly. Slowly. He opened the door and stepped into the cold air of the room. Everything was waiting, the dolls, the rocking horse, the cracked mirror, now whole again. And Evelyn. Not in the mirror this time. She stood in the center of the room, looking just as she had in the photo. Young. Smiling. But her eyes still wrong. Still deep. Still hollow. "You left me," she said. "They told me you didn't mean to. But you promised." Frank took a step forward. "I didn't remember. I was a child. You remembered enough to come back. I never stopped feeling it," he said softly. "I just never knew what it was." Evelyn looked down. Her fingers twisted in front of her like she was trying to tie invisible knots. "I waited so long," she whispered. "In the mirrors. In the dark." She looked up. "Do you want to play again?" Frank hesitated. He looked at the mirror. It shimmered, silver and alive. "Just for a while," he said. "Promise?" He nodded. "This time," Evelyn whispered, stepping closer. "I'll hide." The mirror lit up like a full moon. Wind surged through the room. The dolls' heads turned all at once. And Evelyn vanished. The room was empty again. Evelyn was gone. The mirror's glow faded slowly, retreating like the last breath of a dream. Frank stood motionless in the center of the room, the photo still in his hand, the memory sharp in his mind like a newly uncovered scar. She'd asked to play again. She said she'd hide. And now, what? For the first time, Frank noticed something new on the bedroom floor. A series of small, chalk-white footprints. Child-sized. Bare. They trailed out of the room. Into the hallway. And down the stairs. He followed them. Not in fear, but in understanding. This was her house now. It had been, ever since she'd been left behind. But maybe, just maybe, this game could still end. The footprints led him through the parlor and into the basement. He hadn't returned there since the whispers began. Since the mirror cracked. But now he descended, step by step, into the dark, holding only a candle and Helen's photo pressed tight to his chest. The footprints stopped in front of the largest mirror, still upright, still cracked. On its surface, fog formed slowly. Then shapes. Words. "Come find me." Frank stepped close. "Where?" he whispered. The mirror shimmered, and in its depths, a familiar scene emerged, the attic. But different. Dustier. Darker. Time inside the glass had moved differently. He turned on his heel and ran. Back in the attic, he pushed open every box, moved every trunk, crawling on hands and knees. And then he saw it, a small, square door in the far corner, long sealed shut with rusted nails and a faded rug thrown over it. He pried it open. Inside, the crawl space was barely 4 feet high. He crawled in. And at the end, huddled against the wall, was a child's skeleton. Small. Curled in a fetal position. Hands covering its face. Frank stopped breathing. There were scratches all around the space. Dozens. Hundreds. Tiny fingernail marks. The remains of a doll, head cracked, lay beside the child. One shoe. He knew the truth then. She hadn't fallen down the stairs. She'd hidden too well. And no one had ever found her. Until now. Frank sat in the crawl space with her until sunrise. He whispered apologies. He wept. He told her he remembered. That she wasn't alone. Not anymore. When he emerged, blinking against the light, the house felt different. Still. Light. The whispering had stopped. And in the mirror on the wall just outside the attic, Evelyn stood one last time. She smiled. But this smile was different, quiet, gentle. "Thank you," she mouthed. And then she was gone. Frank spent the next week in near silence. He didn't speak to neighbors. Didn't answer calls. He just moved through the house slowly, deliberately, as though each room required its own quiet farewell. The mirror in the study never whispered again. The rocking horse in the boarded room never swayed. The hallway, once thick with dread, now simply creaked like an old home should. He had called the town registrar. Told them he found human remains sealed in the attic crawlspace. They sent men with gloves and careful eyes. One of them, an older officer, asked no questions, just looked at Frank and nodded, like some things didn't need to be said aloud. They didn't accuse him. They didn't press. Maybe because they already knew. Or maybe because the house had its own reputation. Evelyn's name was never printed. Just unidentified juvenile remains, approximate, age 9, 1970s. Frank buried the photo in the backyard beside the old lilac tree, next to the box of mirror shards, now still and cold. He didn't say a prayer. He just said, "I remember now." On the last night he spent in the house, the wind blew soft across the roof. The moon hung low, brushing the attic window with silver. He didn't wake at 3:11. He didn't hear her. He didn't need to. In the morning, Frank loaded up his truck. Only a few boxes. A coffee thermos. Helen's necklace. The stuffed rabbit. He placed them gently on the passenger seat. As he stood by the front door, one last time, he looked up the staircase. And for a moment, just a breath, he saw her. Not Evelyn, exactly. Just a flicker of her silhouette at the top of the stairs, where sunlight kissed the old wallpaper. She didn't move. She didn't speak. But Frank nodded to her. And she nodded back. Then she was gone. He left the key under a stone by the porch. And as he drove away, he didn't look back. But in the rearview mirror, for just a second, the house blinked into view. A little girl stood in the front window. Not sad. Not angry. Just watching. And as the road curved and the trees closed around him, she disappeared. For good. The end.